Hello and welcome to Applique Fundamentals. My name is DJ Anderson. Applique can be a lot of fun to create, and many people when they start creating applique designs, they use their software tools like the Applique tool and the settings that are available to them. But when they start to create more applique designs, they quickly learn that there are limitations to using automated applique tools. In this video, I will show you how to use the applique tools in your software, how to do designs manually with more control and freedom, and how to use a combination of the two. As mentioned in the Applique Fundamentals document, there are 3 basic steps to creating applique designs. I will go through these steps while creating multiple applique techniques. So let's get started. We're going to start by taking a look at what are good candidates for applique designs. So I'm going to bring this example in. This is something that you saw on the document for Applique Fundamentals, and I have a couple pieces of artwork here. You can see I'm going to change this over to inches here so you can see about how big this design is. And I do apologize, software is going a little slow with this recording software going, but you can see it's about an inch, not quite a 1 1/4 of an inch by about 1.5 inches wide from side to side. If I come in here and I measure the width of this bat, you can see it's only a little over 1/4 of an inch. Now this is something that wouldn't really be a good candidate for applique because it's so small. As you can see here, if I put the satin stitch around the edge, there's not much fabric that shows through. And so it would be better just to utilize like a fill stitch in here. If I go over to this image here, it's close to the same size as the bat, but there's more area in this area right here. There's more fabric that can show through if I do applique. So you can see down here in this example that you can see a lot of the fabric through, and that's what you're really kind of looking for. Now this is still really small. I'm zoomed in to 246%. So if I come in here and I go to 100%, you'll really see how small of an area this is for, applique. It just wouldn't work well. This one still works pretty good, but this is still a little bit on the smaller side. If I measure the width of this area from here to here, you're at about 0.75 inches. So about 3/4 of an inch, which is still on the small side. You can get away with it by doing it at about this size, but you don't want to go too much smaller because you want to make sure when you're doing applique, the purpose of it is to enhance the look of the design. Using the applique fabric as a decorative element in the design. So I just wanted to take a second to look at what are good and bad candidates. Obviously there's a lot of different shapes out there, and you just kind of have to use your judgment. But always, if you're bringing a design in the software and you have it sized to where you want it to be, you'll always want to measure, and you'll always want to look at the design at 100% so that you get a better idea of how big that piece is, because it's very easy to zoom in inside a software and make things look a lot bigger than what they are. So I just wanted to point that out really quick. The first design that we're going to focus on is one that is going to utilize a standard border, like a satin stitch border. So let me go ahead and bring this image up here. So what I have here is I have an image of a regular fabric that would be like what you would hoop, and then applique fabric that is going to go on top of it. And this is just to show you, kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about. There's no stitches in here, and I can turn those off, and you can see I'm left with just this piece of artwork here. And so we're going to focus a little bit on how to create and structure an applique design. So as we learned in the Applique Fundamentals document, there's 3 basic stitches that we work with when we're doing applique. We have what we call a placement stitch, and that stitch is the first stitch that goes down onto the main fabric that works as a template so that you know where to place the applique fabric. Second thing you have is a tack down stitch, and that tack down stitch is used to actually lock the applique fabric down to the main fabric that's hooped, so that when you're going to do a border stitch later, it's held in place. It also allows you, if you're cutting the fabric after you do the tack down stitch and not pre-cutting it, it allows you to keep that in place, making it easy for you to cut around it before you actually do the border stitch. So the last thing is the border stitch, or the decorative stitch, that's going to actually be the main thing that's going to really lock the applique fabric to the hooped fabric. And so we're going to explore those three things and how you would go about creating each. And it's actually a lot simpler than what you think it might be. So the first thing is we have to create the applique, the main stitch, or the placement line. And like I mentioned before, there is some applique tools that you can use, or you can do it manually. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually show you how to use an applique tool inside of software. And I'm using the Floriani Total Control U software. It's a software that I work with to do all my designs, and your software might be different, but I'm sure that there's probably an applique tool available. And if there's not, that's okay, because I'm going to show you how to create the stitches manually as well. And that's actually how I prefer to do applique designs, and you'll see why as you get doing more and more applique. There are limitations to an applique tool. But let me go ahead and grab the applique tool here, and I'm going to go to my digitizing tools, and I'm going to come to my applique stitch. So what I have to do is I have to trace around the design, and I'm using the applique tool, which works kind of as like a single line outline, and then it will convert this line into actual stitches. So you do have to take your time and go around the design, but it's not that difficult. Basically what you're doing is you're tracing at this point, and tracing is something that you have to get used to and comfortable with when it comes to digitizing, because you're always going to be going around objects, and regardless of the tool you're using, you are going to be tracing around something. Or even if you create it from scratch, you're still going to be utilizing these same tools. So I'm just going to go around this design, and I do apologize because it does take a little bit of time. And there are different ways of doing this. I'm using obviously the applique tool. Drop the stitch there. And you could set this up in Floriani software. You could use a running stitch, and the artwork stitch, or artwork tool I should say, and that artwork tool can then be used to create the outline, and then you convert that outline into an applique piece. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like, because I did do that already, and it's actually kind of how I prefer to do it, but not every software does that. So I wanted to show you just using a regular applique tool how you would go about creating it, because this should be very similar to whatever software program that you utilize. I'm going to go ahead and close that shape here, and when I close it, it automatically creates stitches. Now it did more than just create a border stitch that you see right here. It's actually created a placement stitch, a tack down stitch, and a border stitch. And I can see that if I come in here and I do a little slow redraw, you're going to see that it's going to do this run stitch. This is the placement stitch, and then it's going to come in and do a tack down stitch. So basically after the placement stitch, you'd lay the fabric down, and then it would come in and do this tack down stitch, and this would lock it down to the hooped fabric, and then the last thing it's going to do is a border. So by creating that outline around the shape, it's automatically created all three of the types of stitches that I need for a basic applique. And I can come over here and I can go to my sequence view, and you can see that I do have a couple other pieces here. That's just this backgrounds. I can turn all those off, so you can see that what I have is this piece of applique. And if in the Floriani software, it kind of combines everything together. And so you'll see that if I come over here, I have 3 different stitch types, or in different colors too. And that's important as well, because you need it to be different colors so that the machine will stop between each sequence. So you can see that I have this one, which is going to be the placement stitch, this one that's going to be the tack down stitch, and I can change the color of it if I want inside the software just by going and clicking a color. So if I wanted this border to be purple, because I have it selected here, I can just click on purple and it's going to change that. So if I do a slow redraw again, you'll see it's going to do a placement stitch, and after this placement stitch, this software is basically creating another color for the tack down, so that you have time at your machine that you can lay the fabric down, you can put it in place, and then you can start the machine again so that it will do the tack down, so it'll tack that fabric down. And then the last thing, it'll stop after it does the tack down, allowing you to cut around the edge if you're going to do that manually. So you would want to do that after the tack down and before you start the border stitch. And if you did a pre-cut that was cut to size, then you wouldn't need to cut around the edge, because it would already be perfectly cut. And I would be using like a fabric cutter machine to pre-cut your fabric. So if I go and hit play again, you can see that it's going to go around the edge, and it's going to finish that applique. And I'll speed this up a little bit. So that is the basics of doing applique. Now if you're doing a design that, I'm going to turn these back on so you can see an examples here. If you're doing an applique design that you really just don't need to do anything special, you definitely can utilize a applique tool to create that. It's just if you want to have a little bit more control, you would want to do that yourself manually. And basically, I'm going to hit undo, and let's say we had this piece of applique, and I went around the edge with the applique tool. I can convert that in the Floriani software to a running stitch, and because it's just following that same line that I created when I went around the edge. And so I wanted to show you that if you're creating your own applique, you would do the same thing. You would do it where you would create a run stitch around the edge for your placement stitch. The next thing that you would want to do is create your tack down stitch. So if you use a running stitch in your software and trace around the edge of where that applique is going to be, the great thing is that you've already created your tack down as well. All you have to do is copy it and paste it to make a duplicate. You can see I have 2 here, and then just change the color of one of them so that now after it does the placement stitch, the tack down stitch will go. Now one of the things that I do like to do is I like to utilize either a double run, and that's primarily what I use for the tack down, because I like to make sure that it tacks it down really well. So in the Floriani software, I can come up to the type here and do a double run and hit apply. The other thing you could do is just copy and paste this run stitch again so that it does it twice, if that makes sense. So as you can see, if I go here, it's doing the placement stitch. It's going to stop. Now it's going to do the tack down, and because I chose a double, you can see that it's going to go around this design, and then it's going to go around it again. So it's going to go over it twice. That's just really going to lock it in place. I kind of like to do that. It works well for me, especially if I'm going to cut the fabric myself. Now there's one thing that I do want to mention at this point, and if you're using a fabric cutter to cut it to size, I definitely recommend that you utilize your applique tool first. And the reason for that is if I go back here and I get it back to where it's using the applique, the reason for that is if you're cutting your fabric to size, after it does the running stitch for the placement line, that's where you're going to place the fabric, and it's going to fit perfectly in that area. Now, if your fabric is cut perfect to that size as well, if you try to do a run stitch in the exact same location as where the placement stitch was, it's not going to grab the fabric. There's not any excess fabric for it to grab as it does another run stitch. So what an applique tool does is that it will allow you, or it automatically does, it creates that tack down stitch indented. So what I mean by that is if I come in here and I go here, I do this placement stitch, notice that on this tack down, it's actually inside of the purple. So if I take it off 3D view and I zoom in a little bit, and then we go back here, you can see, let me turn that fabric off, you can see that this tack down is indented. That is to ensure that it's going to grab the fabric with that tack down stitch. You can manually do that yourself. It's just a little bit easier if you use an applique to do it, applique tool. And you'll see in here that in the properties, and most software programs will allow you to adjust your applique settings. They might not let you do quite as much as what the Floriani software does, and so there might be some limitations there. But if you own the Floriani software, you have a lot of flexibility here. So you have your applique type, which is a satin border here. I have the width at 3. I might want to change that to 4. I like to utilize something like a 4 a lot of times, a little bit thicker. And density, and you have your applique inset. And the applique inset, basically you see it says 50%. Well, if I hide this tack down stitch really quick, this placement stitch, what that means is your border is going to, the halfway point of this border is going to be right along this line. So if I change this, so it means that your stitches are going to be 50% on the fabric and 50% off the fabric. Now, if I'm cutting the fabric myself after I tack it down, I'm definitely going to utilize at least a 50% because I need to have some extra room here so that the fabric doesn't poke out. But if I change this to something like a 75, what this means is it's going to be 75% on the fabric and 25% off the fabric for the border. So I'm going to change that back. Those are just some of the settings that you do have. I'm going to turn back on this tack down stitch. And then I can go to this applique extra, which is the next tab over. And I have the ability to change the stitch length, which is nice. I usually use the default here, and the tack down. And the tack down can either be a run stitch or a zigzag stitch. I recommend that you utilize a run stitch if you're going to be cutting the fabric yourself after you tack it down, because that zigzag stitch, as you can see, if I change it to a zigzag and hit apply, now what it's going to do is it's just going to tack down the fabric, but your stitches are going to go all the way out to here. So if you cut the fabric around this zigzag, it's definitely going to poke out. So I always set this to a run stitch if I'm cutting the fabric myself. Now, if I was using a cutting machine, I would use the zigzag, and because it's going to have a better chance of grabbing that fabric. Because it is at the exact size. So the other thing though I want to point out about this is that you have the ability to change the offset of the tack down. Right now it's 0.5 millimeters indented, but a lot of times I'll come in and I'll change that to like a 0.8, and I'll bring it in a little bit more. And the reason is because when I go and I cut that fabric around this tack down stitch, it gives me plenty of room here to make sure that the border grabs all of the fabric. So I hope that that makes sense. That's a great feature inside of the Applique tool that in the Floriani software that allows you to adjust that. So I just wanted to point those things out. Those are some of the things that you do when you're working with Applique and you're using the Applique tool. This is when it's nice, is that you can get this indented tack down stitch. So again, that's for if you're going to be pre-cutting your fabric. You definitely need that indented if you're going to be pre-cutting. Now, that being said, if you pre-cut it and you just use a zigzag, this will grab it as well. So you technically don't have to do it, but it is nice to be able to utilize this feature, the Applique tool, to give you that indented tack down stitch. So the next thing that I wanted to show you with this is we've looked at manually doing it. So if I go forward or I go back, I need to get it back to where it was that run stitch, or I can just convert it to a run. And so previously we talked about you need to make sure that you have all the stitches that you need: a placement, a tack down, and a border. So if you need to create it yourself, you can see that I have this placement stitch. I can copy it and I can paste it like I showed you a little bit ago, and I can change the color, and now I have a placement stitch and a tack down stitch. And the great thing about software is most of the programs now allow you to convert from one thing to another pretty easy. So if I take this tack down stitch and I change it to a double run, so it gives me a little bit more to work with. Now what I can do is I can copy it and paste it to make a third one. I can change the color of it, so now I have a placement, a tack down, and then I have this run here. But in most software programs, you can convert a run stitch to a, what in the Floriani software is a steel satin. If I click on that, it's going to create this satin stitch that is the same width from side to side all the way through it. And I can change the settings of this satin stitch. So basically I can create my own placement, tack down, and border stitch very easily. I can do all of those based off of the one run stitch, placement stitch. Then I can just copy paste it and convert it to like a border, or making a double run stitch for the tack down. The biggest thing with Applique is make sure you change the colors. So the placement's a different color from the tack down. The border is a different color from the tack down. And the reason for that is you need your machine to stop between each step. So it's just an important thing to make sure that you do. So this is how to create a basic applique design. Now, one of the things that I do want to show you as well, if you do it manually and you're working with pre-cut fabric, I'm going to turn off this border and I'm going to go to this tack down stitch right here. So again, I have a placement, tack down, border. I'm on this tack down stitch. If I was using pre-cut fabric and I want to make sure that I grab the fabric because it's at the exact size, all I really have to do here is convert this tack down to a steel stitch again, just like I did for the border, but this time I can change the density to something like a 2, so it's really open, as you can see here. The other thing that I can do with it is I can come over here in the Floriani software and the general tab. I can change the connection end, which is right now sharp, meaning it goes, when it does the stitch, it goes up and then over, up, over. And if I change it to a zigzag, it'll go kind of in between here. So it'll make it a zigzag stitch. So if I hit apply, you can see that that's more like a standard I'll change the color so you can see it better. That's more like a standard tack down stitch that's using a zigzag. So now in this design, turn this border on as well. If I do a slow redraw here, you'll see that it will do a placement stitch. Then it's going to do this zigzag to tack it down. So after the placement, I would have laid my pre-cut fabric down in place, and then I would do this tack down as a zigzag stitch to make sure it grabs the fabric, and then the border. And that's the basics of doing a applique design. I've shown you how to use an applique tool and also do it manually. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at how to create a raw edge applique design, which is very popular. And so I'll see you in the next video.